The last time we talked about the raid was 2 weeks ago, basically right as the first reset of 11.0.5 ended and we got the second round of big balance tuning that came right after the patch. So it's been a long time since we checked any proper results in the raid and analyzed a few of the things happening right now, and there are some interesting changes in the raid in terms of spec performance because of the balance tuning. Now, you would be wondering, well, but it's been 2 months since the release of the season. Isn't it a little bit too late to sort of, care about what goes down in the raid? Shouldn't it be a bit more important to care about, for example, how your spec is meta in Mythic Plus? Plenty of players would be saying right now, like, well, I don't really care if Frost DK is one of the worst performers in the raid right now, as long as they are meta in Mythic Plus. I'm gonna find way more time to play in Mythic Plus, so I would rather have my spec to be doing well in Mythic Plus right now. However, think about it. Right now, we are almost 2 months after the release of this season, and we have about 160 kills on Ansoric. This was 2 months after the release of Vault of the Incarnates and the release of Dragonflight, and the amount of kills of Razaget was roughly 170. So we are in practically the same 2 months span after the release of the tier, and we have more or less the same kills. And at the end of the tier, at the end of Vault, we ended up seeing some 1,900 kills of Razaget. So if we stay and we assume a similar number at the end of Nerubar Palace, then we are not even 10% of the kills in for Ansorek. So it's still quite relevant to check out. I mean, the Hall of Fame isn't even closed. So we're still talking about the power level of specs for guilds that are still fighting for Hall of Fame, for example. They are still fighting for the last few hard bosses in the raid. So it will still be relevant for many players. Now, the highlight for today goes on 3, we can say, more niche and hipster specs that we might not have talked about often when we talk about the raid. We might have shown some light on some specs here and there in these past few weeks, like Elemental, like Enhancement, like the Mage specs, the several buff and changes going the way of the Ranged Hunter specs, even the buffs given to Balanced Druid, even changes going the Healer's way in the raid. However, for today, more focus can be put on Destruction, it can also be put on Survival, and it can also be put on Assassination. These 3 are, we can say, pound for pound, the best performers in the raid right now, after the current best DPS overall in the entire game, both across Mythic Plus and the raid, which is Enhancement. But that was already known. It is also something you have been seeing already in Mythic Plus, for example, right? Enhancement is so meta, it is pushing out a Shaman Healer out of the meta just to stay in the group. That's how powerful it is already. So this was not a surprise for Enhancement to be doing well. However, talking about, average throughput, average DPS results in the raid, we do have a few handful specs that are pretty interesting right now, especially due to not being perhaps very popular or very considered, like Destro, Assassination, and Survival. Now, definitely, of course, talking about the surprises and the changes, looking at this 2 weeks after the balance tuning that happened 2 weeks ago, the biggest of the changes goes the way of Destro, because before any of this happened, Destro was at the bottom of the results. Then 11.0.5 happened, not actually much happens in 11.0.5 for Destro. There was only a footnote for Destro, a QOL, slight QOL change for their Demonic Ritual and Touch of Rancora talent for Diabolist, which wasn't really that relevant, so they continued to be doing quite badly in that week. And then the second week after the release of 11.0.5, that's where suddenly we had the flip. Why? Because in that change, in that week of changes, Warlock was hit by many buffs, and many of which included Destruction Warlock, which is what gave them this facelift after this patch. The other one that received improving results after 11.0.5 has been also Survival Hunter, which has also received quite a lot of changes. This was straight up in 11.0.5, all of these changes to the spec. Now, the curious part, the peculiar part of Destruction is that if you go and check at the top results boss by boss, sometimes you expect specs that you see here to be the best at something, right? You're like, well, for example, Fury Warrior. Fury Warrior is very high up in the results, right? But then you check the actual damage done to bosses and Fury Warrior is here. So they are trash. Their single target damage is very poor. So you go, for example, at the top results of the Bloodbound Horror, which does have some ad spawning, and you do see multiple Fury Warriors making the top results on this boss. If you check, for example, Sick Run, which is pure single target, Fury Warriors go away on the top results. Then you go back to more ads on Broad Twister and you know it, there's Fury Warrior popping up again in the top results, and then you go back to a single target fight like Nexus Princess, no more Fury Warriors, and then back to an AoE fight like Queen Ansorek, and again it's Fury Warrior time. So you do see sometimes some specs being here, not because they are best at everything, not because they are top results at everything, like Enhancement, which can show up pretty much regardless if whether or not you are looking at an AoE fight, or if you're looking at a pure single target fight like Nexus Princess, maybe you are looking at a 2-target fight like Silken Court, you're still gonna be seeing Enhancement Shamans everywhere, but besides them, there might be some specs specialized in AoE, specialized in single target, that can do better in certain fights, as we have just seen, like Broad Twister, for example, in AoE for Fury Warrior, and for example, another spec, BM Hunter, doing very poorly in AoE, but then you go back to Nexus Princess, pure single target, BM Hunter is here, and Fury Warrior is here, right? In the case of Destruction, they are actually the reverse. Destruction isn't actually dominating anything other than one much more niche type of damage profile, right? If we go by every boss, you will find Destro in the middle, slightly below the average for the first boss. Bloodbound Horror has some AoE, Destro is again bang average. You also have Rashanan, which is single target with a lot of movement and some ads spawning, Destro is again bang average. Broad Twister, more ads spawning, Destro is bang average. Pure single target, Nexus Princess, Destro is doing better, but still not at the top. And then the 2-target Cleave, where Destro is the best spec together with Affliction. But that is only one boss, right? Overall, Destro has this quality where regardless the boss you're looking at, they are always average or slightly better, slightly above average consistently on most bosses. Whereas other specs, as we have seen, like Fury, can be good in AoE fights and much worse in single target fights, or specs like BM can be much better in single target fights and then much worse in AoE fights. In the case of Destro, it's more about their consistency throughout all of the types of boss fights. Now, the melee version of this set of results would be Survival. Survival has a similar type of damage profile in the sense that no matter the type of fight that you will see in here, Survival is never outright bad. You can see them here on Olgrax, they are in the top third of results. Bloodbound Horror does have some AoE, Survival is bang average, back to a pure single target fight, Survival is top results. Rashanan, a bunch of ads spawning around, Survival is back to being average, back to more ads spawning, Survival is still average. So even in AoE fights, they don't just drastically lose a lot more damage like some other kinds of good single target specs, like for example BM. And then you move back to single target fights, and again Survival is doing very well. Even on Silken Court, which is a very specific, 2-target cleave type of fight, they actually still continue to do very well. And then lastly, you have the most important fight of the tier, because it's the last boss, and still on the last boss, Survival is still doing well. So actually, technically, in terms of average results across the tier, across all bosses, Survival is the best of the specs, together with Enhancement. The only weakness of Survival is, of course, that they are still quite unpopular, as opposed to what we've been talking about, in this case, Destro and Assassination, which are definitely not what you would call unpopular. Survival definitely is, which is why we have been seeing these very wacky lines for Survival, right? Yeah, sure, they are in the top 5, but the worst results are still far lower down than the average. Same goes for Ansorek. Yes, they are third, but they are much more wacky, because if you look at the parses, you only have about 8 parses for a Survival Hunter, for example. So Survival is also doing very well, even better than Destruction, in the sense that while Destro is kind of solid average on all types of fights, Survival is not only solid in all kinds of AoE fights, but also amongst the best when it comes to single target fights across the board throughout the entire tier. We can also look at the AoE fights, looking at the damage done to bosses, and here you will see survival, only outdone by the best of the focus single target specs right now, which is Assassination. And Assassination is the third of the specs we are talking about today in focus. For this very same reason. Assassination right now in their build, they can have very high single target damage. They still have the weakness, we can call it like that, of AoE damage, especially having to talent for AoE damage. We can say talenting for, you know, Mythic Plus build, for example, which would make them lose way more AoE damage. You can see them here being quite far down on Olgrax, with some adds spawning, dying far too quickly on a boss where the adds can stay alive for a little bit longer, like Bloodbound Horror. They start to be doing much better, even in AoE. Back to a single target fight, still doing great. Another fight with decently long-lasting adds is going to be Broad Twister, which is where Assassination can also do well. Compare this, for example, to the other, you know, good single target specs as we mentioned, like Survival or like Destro or even like BM Hunter, and Assassination is doing significantly better. Back to a pure single target fight like Nexus Princess, Assassination is still doing very well. Two target fight, it is something that Assassination can take advantage of with their dots on two targets. And lastly, you have Ansurek, which is perhaps their weaker type of fight. Perhaps also what is a bit more unfortunate for Assassination. You see, for example, that they are actually less than Subtlety Rogue players, which gives you a pretty important picture on how much weaker they are in this type of fight, in this type of damage profile, because if you go back to all of the bosses, on average, this is Sub, and this is Assassination. And Sub is beating Assassination in popularity on the last boss of the tier right now. So that's, if anything, their main weakness in terms of their value. They are doing quite well in single target fights. They are still doing quite well on AoE boss fights with long-lasting enough adds where they can get value from them, but right now the last boss is actually not any of that. Both the P2 adds as well as the small spiderlings P3 adds are just dying far too quickly for them to gain any value from, compared to, for example, the much quicker and faster funnel value that a spec like Subtlety Rogue can gain from those adds. So that is perhaps their main weakness right now as a spec. The fact that, yes, perhaps maybe even across all bosses before Ansurek, they are the best one. However, the last boss has more value, right? Last boss, you know, would you, for example, quiz for today, would you rather be the best spec overall in terms of damage on the first 4 bosses and be poor on the last? Or would you want to be poor on the first 4 and the best spec on the last boss of the tier? Not all bosses are created equal in terms of how important it is for you to be good in. It's definitely 3 specs worth highlighting for today. After a couple of weeks of the changes of the balance tuning, we have seen these spec raise in value, especially the two buffed ones, the 2 changed ones, Survival and Destruction. Right now, their value, their power level in the raid has increased significantly right now in the season. Now, the other thing we might be looking at based on the changes of the balance tuning of a couple of weeks ago are the results of the healers. But again, we have to be a little bit boring once more, because the results of the healers are still quite even and quite balanced. Because if you look at the difference, even if you start looking at the difference of, you know, healing logs that were kind of decent enough, you know, like a 50-ish percentile result, you have Resto Shaman being at 1.35 million and Mistweaver being at 1.38, and then you have Evoker being at 1.41. So practically, besides the Evoker being some 5-ish% ahead of these specs, all these specs are very, very close. Between Mistweaver and Restoration Shaman, there is 30,000 HPS. 30,000 HPS is 2% healing. We have to bring back our example we do here, which is Source of Magic. Source of Magic is an Evoker buff that gives you 3% more healing. And very rarely is your raid going to have 4 Evokers, which means that in a raid with 4 healers and only 2 Evokers, only 2 of these healers will get Source of Magic, meaning only 2 of the healers will get a 3% healing buff. and the other 2 will not. So if you were, for example, to give the Resto Shaman 3% more healing, this 1.35 would go up to 1.39. So they will now go up all the way above Mistweaver, for example. So practically the first 5 healers there isn't really much to talk about in terms of difference. The only thing that is interesting is the fact that from the release of 11.0.5, so from before this set of changes, Mistweaver was here. So Mistweaver, before these changes, they were at almost 1.2 million, which was some 40 to 45, to 50,000 HPS below all of the other healers. And instead now, into the second week of 11.0.5, they are practically even with the rest. Now, did something happen to them in this couple of weeks? Well, in 11.0.5, they did receive a series of changes, slightly positive overall, but what also tipped them over the edge was that the week after that, they also got, well, very simply, 6% all healing buff, on top of more positive changes. So actually it's overall closer to a 10% healing buff overall since we checked them here. It makes complete sense for them to now be here after a couple of weeks of these changes, and actually just 1 week after the flat healing buff. So nothing really strange in terms of results from a couple of weeks ago to now with the healers if we add the buff given to Mistweaver, which was the only major buff going the way of healers in these past couple of weeks. And even then, as mentioned, practically all of these 5 healers are very close to each other, and the only slight outlier are the 2 priests, which is perhaps the more interesting one, right? Because if you look at before 11.0.5, it was even more even. The other 2 priests were perfectly in line with the other healers. It was crazy. Holy Paladin was 1.249, Discipline was 1.239, so you had all of these healers between 10,000 HPS. But now, after a couple of weeks, it has gotten a bit more skewed, with the 2 priests being a bit lower down, despite the priests themselves not actually being nerfed in this patch. There might be a combination of tiny things that cause this. Perhaps there are, more Holy Priest players losing healing because they are competing with Mistweaver Monk, which have a similar consistent throughput healing as a Holy Priest, and now they have been buffed. Or maybe Discipline Priest has fewer bursts of healing to heal because the bosses are being nerfed. Everyone gets more item level, they get more stamina, they stay alive for longer, they can survive more, they don't need nearly as much burst healing as a Discipline Priest, and they lose out to more throughput healing spec like Restoration Druid, like Mistweaver Monk. Or maybe simply Discipline Priest players are just too busy rerolling to playing Mythic Plus only, and they are forgetting how to play in the raid. That might also be a reason why. But yes, definitely overall, the major changes have been happening down the DPS category rather than the healers, where the one major switcheroo was the buff going the way of Mistweaver. So for today, this was the recap of the situation of the raid after missing out on looking at how things have been going in here for a couple of weeks, and since we have gotten not 1 but 2 sets of balance tuning since a couple of weeks ago, it was good to just look at all of these sets of results going down right now in the raid in terms of the power, as well as the popularity of the specs in the meta of Mythic raids. So with this out of the way, on this apparently weekend, it is now time to leave each other. We're now starting as usual the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone who is also supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I hate it. Apparently, if I have a cold and my nose is closed, I cannot sleep if I breathe with my mouth. It's just impossible.